Our chairman has given a very erudite and succinct summary of the title, and in fact the title comes, by the way, from the 1st of Chronicles chapter 23 verse 1, which we shan't turn to this morning, but it says there that when David was old and full of days, that he made Solomon his son king. And in fact that's the story that we're going to look at this morning, but we're going to take our charter this morning not from the book of Chronicles, but from the record in the 1st of Kings. And in that chapter that we had read this morning by way of introduction at our morning devotions. Because the 1st of Kings is going to follow hard on the heels. Well, let's come and have a look at it. Do you notice how the 1st of Kings follows on immediately from the Samuel record of the plague, the census and the plague that had occurred? So in the 2nd of Samuel, chapter 24, it says this in the last verse. And David built there an altar unto Yahweh and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So Yahweh was entreated for the land, and the plague was stayed from Israel. Now King David was old and stricken in years, and they covered him with clothes, but he gat no heat. And I think that the fact that the very circumstances of the difficulties of David in the 1st of Kings 1, following on immediately after the story of the census, tells us, I believe, that David did not escape unscathed from the matter of the pestilence, as Psalm 30, as Psalm 30 suggested to us. You remember how that in the prayer of David in that psalm, he said that he had cried to the Lord and the Lord had healed him and prevented him from going down into the grave. I think David was entering the final year of his life as this episode of the pestilence moved forward. We're going to come to that, God willing, in one of our later studies. But I think that the decrepitude of the man in the 1st of Kings chapter 1 is not just the decrepitude of old age. I think that David in this episode is a man reduced to a shadow of his former self, a man who lies cold and still upon his bed, not just the result of old age, but of a genuine physical affliction that prostrated the king and left him bereft of his powers. And I think that the anxiety and anguish of the plague that had come truly and rightly upon the flock of Israel had reached out to smite the shepherd and bring him low also. In fact, when it says in the 1st of Kings, chapter 1 and verse 1, that they covered him with clothes, that word clothes, I think, in this particular context is bed clothes, not the garments of outdoor wear, but the clothes or the cloths that come upon the bed. I think that David was bedridden in this episode. We're going to be told that in verse 15 and verse 47 also of the 1st of Kings chapter 1, that David is prostrate upon his bed at this particular time. Now, as this chapter unfolds, I want us to enter into the circumstances of just how sad this moment is in David's life. You see, David's powers have not just faded here. I think he had approached death itself. He was smitten with an illness related to his age, but brought on by the anxiety of the matter of the pestilence. And I think his life itself was in danger at this time. And this is what had happened, brothers and sisters. You see, David's life had begun once his kingship was established, with his mastery of a far-flung empire where heathen kings trembled at the mention of his name, David, the King of Israel. And then his power had diminished to the rulership of Judah after several episodes of revolt within greater Israel. And then it had declined to his command in Jerusalem and the royal capital which he had established there. And then it had reduced to his control of the palace compound, which spread over Zion's hill. And then it shrank to his influence over the king's chamber, with the few servants who waited upon him. And now, in the 1st of Kings, chapter 1, now his dominion stretches no further than the end of his bed, and he cannot even manage that, for he shivers in the weakness of a body that he cannot rule. Oh yes, brothers and sisters, this is a low point in David's life, the moment of the 1st of Kings, chapter 1. The record tells us in verse 1 that he gat no heat, and his servants said unto him, Let there be sought for my lord the king a young virgin, and let her stand before the king, and let her cherish him, and let her lie on thy bosom, that my lord the king may get heat. His circulation had deteriorated to the point where he couldn't get warm. I don't think there was anything more in the matter of Abishag than that, by the way, but physicians of all ages had recommended that departing vitality could be benefited by the introduction of the warmth and vitality of a youthful person. And so Abishag was brought to try and at least give the king warmth upon the bed that he lay upon prostrate. And at that time, says verse 5, at the time when David was utterly prostrated by this illness, the record says that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. Do you know, in the margin, you'll find a cross-reference to the book of Samuel and to an earlier occasion in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 15 and verse 1, where Absalom on an earlier occasion prepared chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And what we're told that happened was this, is that David was smitten with illness at the time, and Absalom took advantage of the illness of his father, and as people came to the gate of Jerusalem, he would say to each man, What is thy cause? And whither comest thou? And the man would tell Absalom his business, and Absalom would say, See, thy matters are right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. And Absalom said, Oh, that I were made a judge in Israel, and I should give every man his due. And the record says he stole the hearts of the men of Israel, and he took advantage of the illness of his father. And in effect, he said Absalom, I will be king. And he made chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him as a bodyguard. That's exactly what Adonijah does here, modeled on his older brother, no doubt. He took advantage of the illness of his father and said, I shall be king. He might well have been David's oldest son at this time. And the chariots and the horsemen and the runners were a royal bodyguard that indicated that he was the king to be. So why, brothers and sisters, why this proud and ungracious spirit in a son of David? And verse 6 says, his father had not displeased him at any time in saying, Why hast thou done so? And he also was a very goodly man, and his mother bare him after Absalom. The New American Standard Bible says, Now his father had never crossed him at any time. And David did have a weakness in not guiding his sons and correcting their mistakes. He'd shown a lack of discipline with Amnon in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. He'd made the same mistake in not properly disciplining Absalom in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 18 and verse 5. And now he will suffer the same problem with Adonijah in the 1st of Kings chapter 1 and verse 6, because he did not correct his sons at crucial moments in their lives when he ought to have done so. And he paid a heavy price for that, brothers and sisters, did King David. And so verse 7 says in the 1st of Kings chapter 1, And he conferred with Joab the son of Zeruiah and with Abiathar the priest, and they, following Adonijah, helped him. You wonder why Joab and why Adonijah threw in their lot, why Joab and Abiathar threw in their lot with Adonijah on this occasion. And of course the answer must surely be is that they were both aware that their jobs were in danger. Joab realized that Benaiah might well be made the captain of the Lord's army. And Abiathar realized that David's favor already rested on Zadok to be the priest. And in order to preserve, therefore, their positions of authority in the land, in order to stop them from being supplanted, they conferred with Adonijah and helped him in the matter of this rebellion. And so verse 8 says, "But Zadok the priest, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet, and Shimei and Rai, and the mighty men which belonged to David, were not with Adonijah. And Adonijah slew sheep and oxen and fat cattle by the stone of Zoeleth, which is by En-rogel, and called all his brethren the king's sons, and all the men of Judah the king's servants." He made his move, did Adonijah, says the record, at a place called En-rogel. Now that's interesting, because if you come back to the book of Joshua, let me just show you a couple of references about En-rogel. In Joshua chapter 15, we're told this. Joshua chapter 15, in the story of the apportioning and allotting of the land, it says this. Joshua 15 verse 1 says, "This was the lot of the tribe of the children of Judah." So here's Judah's portion in the land, says Joshua 15 verse 1. And verse 7, in providing the dimensions of Judah's division, says this. "And the border went up toward Debir from the valley of Achor, and so northward looking toward Gilgal, that is before the going up to Adamim, which is on the south side of the river. And the border passed toward the waters of En-shemesh, and the goings out thereof were at En-rogel," says the story. So En-rogel was on the border of the tribe of Judah. Now come to Joshua chapter 18. We're told in Joshua chapter 18 in verse 11, the record says, Joshua 18 verse 11, "The lot of the tribe of the children of Benjamin came up according to their families." The lot of the tribe of the children of Benjamin. Well, here's the border of Benjamin, says verse 16. "And the border came down to the end of the mountain that lieth before the valley of the son of Hinnom, and which is in the valley of the giants on the north, and descended to the valley of Hinnom, to the side of Jebusi on the south, and descended to En-rogel," says Joshua 18 and verse 16. So En-rogel was on the border between two tribes. The tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin. So why do you think that Adonijah launched his rebellion in that precise spot? And I think he did so, brothers and sisters, in all probability, because straddled between those two places was where the support came for Adonijah, because he'd stolen some of the hearts of the men of Judah, as the record tells us, verse 9, "All the king's sons and all the men of Judah, the king's servants," and they of Judah, at least in part, were with Adonijah. And I think perhaps what Adonijah had done is made an offer or a pact with Benjamin that in return for their support of his kingship, he would restore the tribe of Benjamin to some of its previous glory which had been enjoyed in the days of Saul. Oh, how Benjamin would have loved that. The tribe of Benjamin, a measure of authority in the land again. And it just so happened that the place he chose neatly straddled those two tribes. And I wonder why, brothers and sisters, if that's the case, whether that takes us back to the 1st of Chronicles 21, which we won't turn up in verse 6, and might be the answer as to why Joab, you'll remember, for some unaccountable reason, forgot to tally Benjamin in the census that he brought back in the 1st of Chronicles 21, verse 6 to David. Because Joab probably already knew that the hearts of the men of Benjamin were not with David. No, they'd been stolen for the purpose of Adonijah's rebellion. And so verse 10 of the 1st of Kings chapter 1 says, "Nathan the prophet and Benaiah, the mighty men, and Solomon his brother, he called not." And so Nathan, in despair and in grave concern at this sign of rebellion, Nathan spake unto Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, "Hast thou not heard that Adonijah the son of Haggith doth reign, and David our Lord knoweth it not? Now therefore come, let me, I pray thee, give thee counsel, that thou mayest save thine own life and the life of thy son Solomon. And you see, because David was alone in his bed chamber, bereft of all his powers, they of the nation, including Nathan, one of his dear friends, thought that David didn't know what was going on. I think David probably knew exactly what was going on. And David knew, with all the knowledge of human nature that was at his disposal after 70 years of life, I think he knew precisely what was happening. But David must have felt this immense frustration that despite his knowledge there was nothing he could do. He lay on his bed and shivered and could do nothing about the rebellion of his son. And Bathsheba, says the record, verse 15, went in unto the king into the chamber, and the king was very old, and Abishag the Shunammite ministered unto the king. You can almost feel the gloom of the bed chamber, can you not, brothers and sisters? The darkened room, the curtains pulled, the old man shivering upon the bed, Abishag the Shunammite, and Bathsheba bowed, verse 16, and did obeisance unto the king. And the king said, What wouldst thou? And Bathsheba came in to make her petition. And she said, verse 17, My lord, thou swearest by Yahweh thy God unto thine handmaid, saying, Assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne. And now, behold, Adonijah reigneth, and now my lord the king, thou knowest it not. And he hath slain oxen and fat cattle and sheep in abundance, and hath called all the sons of the king, and Abiathar the priest, and Joab the captain of the host. But Solomon thy servant hath he not called. And thou, my lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are upon thee, that thou shouldest tell them, who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. And she makes her plea on behalf of not only Solomon but herself, that their lives might be preserved. But look at what she says, verse 21, brothers and sisters. Oh, that the Spirit of God must have put these words into the lips of Bathsheba on this occasion. Verse 21. It was just the right thing for her to say. Otherwise it shall come to pass, when my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon shall be counted offenders. If you don't do anything, David, my life will be lost. But she didn't say that. She said, when my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers. Oh, now where did that come from, brothers and sisters? What thinkest thou? That's the promise to David in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7. Now come and have a look. I think the words must have been given under inspiration to Bathsheba to say on this occasion. When my lord the king shall sleep with his fathers, if you don't do something about this, my life and Solomon's life will be forfeit. And David's mind was transported back to an earlier occasion when these words had come to him in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12. And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, so there's the expression of Bathsheba, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom, and he shall build an house for my name. Why, the very thing that was moving David in the matter of the census of Israel, the things concerning the house of God, this one to come will build that house. And David's mind comes back now to the fullness of the promise. And if that king is not set on the throne and not established, then that house will never be built. And you can almost see the thought of that promise, the covenant promise, entering into David's mind as he lay there still upon the bed and energizing the king as he thought upon these things. And verse 22, coming back to the 1st of Kings chapter 1, why, you'd never think what happened. Verse 22 says, Lo, while she yet talked with the king, Nathan the prophet came in, and they told the king and said, Behold, Nathan the prophet, why, the very man who devouts the promise to him in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7 now stands before him. Oh yes, I think David's mind had been taken back to the promise of the covenant made to him, and of the seed that should arise after he slept with his fathers, who would indeed build a house for God's name. And here, I think, was the key to the stirring of David on this occasion. And when Nathan makes his petition, we're told this at the end of the story of that petition that was made. Verse 28. Bathsheba had evidently retired when Nathan had been announced. And so in verse 28 it says, King David answered and said, "Call me Bathsheba." And she came in unto the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king sware and said, "As Yahweh liveth, that hath redeemed my soul out of all distress, even as I swear unto thee by Yahweh Elohim of Israel, saying, Assuredly Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne in my stead, even so will I certainly do this day." Then Bathsheba bowed with her face to the earth and did reverence to the king and said, "Let my lord King David live forever." And King David said, "Call me Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada." And they came before the king. And the king said unto them, "Take with you the servants of your lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule, the royal mule, the sign of royal designation, and bring him down to Gihon. And let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him there, king over Israel, and blow ye with the trumpet, and say, God save King Solomon. And then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead." You know, when you read this chapter, you get the sense of the recovery of David. Can you feel that? A man who lies upon his bed, shivering under his clothes, the drawn curtains, absolutely powerless and unable to do anything in the matter of the nation. And in comes Bathsheba, and with that one phrase, lifted by the Spirit out of the promise to David, "When thou shalt sleep with thy fathers," the mind of David was stirred. And all of a sudden, the king that can do nothing calls Bathsheba back in and calls Nathan in and starts issuing commands and orders. You can almost see him sort of perking up upon his bed, can you not? As all these things start to come into his mind, and the promise thrills him again with the certainty of what God had said should be upon him. And so verse 39 says, "And Zadok the priest took an horn of oil out of the tabernacle and anointed Solomon." Now, you might like to take a note in your margins, brothers and sisters, for reasons that we will clarify tomorrow, is that when it says he anointed Solomon, that phrase in verse 39 correlates to the 1st of Chronicles chapter 23, verse 1. This is the first anointing of Solomon. There shall be another one later on. But the one of the 1st of Kings chapter 1 verse 39 answers to the 1st of Chronicles 23 verse 1, when the record will say, "It came to pass when David was old and full of days that he made Solomon his son king." And it's the anointing of this chapter that the 1st of Chronicles chapter 23 refers to. So coming to the end of the story, we're told this in verse 47. "And you'll remember that they of the rebellion of Adonijah heard the shouts and the noise and the cheering of the anointing of Solomon. And the message came to them, saying that they've caused Solomon to be king. And," says verse 47, "and moreover the king's servants came to bless our Lord King David, saying, God make the name of Solomon better than thy name, and make his throne greater than thy throne. And the king bowed himself upon his bed." You know, I find that statement, again, profoundly moving. This is the day that Solomon, the beloved son of David, was crowned to be king. And David, for all the stirrings of his mind, is so weak in body that he cannot be there. He cannot witness the coronation of his son. The best he could do, says the record, the best he could do was just to nod in approval upon his bed. But he was in good company, was he not, brothers and sisters, when he gave that nod? Because if you come back to the book of Genesis and to the 47th chapter, wasn't there another man who nodded in approval upon his bed at the fulfillment of things yet to come? Because it says, does it not, in Genesis 47, at the end of the chapter, verse 29, The time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph, and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, Swear unto me. And he sware unto him. And Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. And Israel took a charge of his son in the matters of the truth, that the truth would be preserved by his offspring. And he bowed upon the bed's head. And that's exactly what David does here in the 1st of Kings chapter 1 and verse 47. And I think he took a charge of Solomon in just the same way that Israel took a charge of Joseph his son. And we're told of that charge, again, which we won't turn up, in the 1st of Chronicles 22, verses 6 to 11. David takes a charge of Solomon in the same way that he will be faithful to the truth on this occasion when he bowed upon the bed's head. Now, do you know, brothers and sisters, I think David wrote a psalm at this precise moment of time as he lay upon his bed. A psalm that takes us right into the bedchamber and tells us how David felt at this time of desperate, frustrating weakness in his life. Just exactly how he felt. I think he wrote it at this very moment of time. So, shall we come and have a look at that then? It's Psalm 70 and 71. Written, I believe, at the very moment of the 1st of Kings, chapter 1, and the march of Nathan and Bathsheba into the bedchamber of the old man who lay bereft of his powers. Now, it's been suggested, and I think rightly so, that Psalms 70 and 71 are in fact a single psalm, bound together by certain key phrases, and I think it is so. Do you notice, for example, it says this in Psalm 70, verses 1 and 2. Make haste, O God, to deliver me. Make haste to help me, O Yahweh. Let them be ashamed and confounded that seek after my soul. Let them be turned backward and put to confusion that desire my hurt. And those words are going to be repeated in Psalm 71, verses 12 and 13. O God, be not far from me. O my God, make haste for my help. Let them be confounded and consumed that are adversaries to my soul. Let them be covered with reproach and dishonor that seek my hurt, cries the psalmist. And again the phrase will reoccur at the end of verse 24. For they are confounded, they are brought unto shame that seek my hurt. And these phrases become the fabric around which the psalm is woven. Psalm 70 verses 1 and 2, Psalm 71 verses 12 and 13, and the last phrase of verse 24. The man who cries to God that those who are against him might be ashamed and confounded and brought to confusion that seek his hurt. Oh yes, I think this is David's prayer on this occasion. And I'll tell you why. See what the psalm says. Verse 9 of Psalm 71. Cast me not off in the time of old age. Forsake me not when my strength faileth. Verse 18. Now also when I'm old and grey-headed, O God, forsake me not. You see the word old there in Psalm 71, verse 9 and verse 18. That's the same word used in the 1st of Kings, chapter 1, verse 1. And David was old, and he lay upon his bed. And it's the same word in the 1st of Chronicles, chapter 23, verse 1. And it came to pass when David was old and full of days that he made Solomon his son king. Same word, old. Oh yes, I think this is the timing of the psalm, you see. A time when he expected to die, when he was desperately weak, when he was deserted and despised and opposed by those who planned his downfall at this very time, and completely aware of the danger to himself, as this psalm will indicate in verse 4, verse 10, verse 13, verse 24. Oh yes, the king in his bedchamber knew exactly what was going on. He cries out in this psalm to God because there was nothing else left for him to do. Let me show you one or two interesting things about the spirit of this psalm, which I think are consistent with the thinking that David must have had. Do you notice in Psalm 70 in verse 4 it says, let all those that seek and rejoice, let all those that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee, and let such as love thy salvation say continually. You see that word continually. Let them say these things continually. Now that's the same word in Psalm 71 verse 3. Be thou my strong habitation, whereunto I may continually resort. And it's the same word at the end of verse 6 when it says, my praise shall be continually of thee. And it's the same word in verse 14 when it says, but I will hope continually and will yet praise thee more and more. Do you know, brothers and sisters, I think that's the word of an old man. The word continual here means to be constant, you see. It's continual and constant. Old men don't like change. They just want the stability of a life that is continually resting in the praise and hope of the Father. Oh, says David, that might not be changed. I just want that constant, continual, stable, unchanging spirit of resting in the Father and continually being there. Oh yes, that's the word of an old man, don't you think? And you see, this one is like unto it. Verse 8 says, let my mouth be filled with thy praise and with thy honor all the day, he says. And again, verse 15, my mouth shall show forth thy righteousness and thy salvation all the day. Verse 24, my tongue also shall talk of thy righteousness all the day. Well, what else could he do lying upon his bed thinking about his God but to think all the day upon the things that might praise the Father? He had nothing else to do and nothing else that he could do. But you see, this is the wonderful lesson, I think, of the first of Kings, chapter 1, is that this man who lay physically powerless, his mind was alive. His mind was racing on eternal and precious things. Oh yes, the king was very much alive in his mind, was he not? And you know, it's quite interesting. Just one final thing in terms of the spirit of this psalm, and I think this is a lovely thought. Do you know that there are some psalms that talk about the righteousness of David when he writes as a young man, and he talks about God supporting him and God vindicating him and God helping him in his righteousness, in his honor and integrity. I've walked before God with an upright heart. Oh, uphold me in my righteousness, says David in his early years. But when he writes this psalm, he never once talks about his righteousness. Only God's. You see it here? Verse 2 of Psalm 71. Deliver me in thy righteousness. Verse 15. My mouth shall show forth thy righteousness. Verse 16. I will go in the strength of the Lord God, I will make mention of thy righteousness, even of thine only. Verse 19, thy righteousness also, O God, is very high. Verse 24, my tongue also shall talk of thy righteousness all the day. You see, this is the spirit of an older person who has wrestled with sin and who has learned the utter hopelessness of sin's flesh and the all-surpassing greatness of Yahweh's honor and Yahweh's righteousness and Yahweh's goodness to save. There's no righteousness of David left that he wants to talk about. Just the righteousness of God. Isn't that the focus, brothers and sisters, of where godly lives and godly minds should ultimately ascend? just the glory and honor and righteousness of the Father himself, and not ours. We are supremely unimportant in the overall circumstance of life, apart from our relevance to the purpose of God. And you know that if you read this psalm, it's a marvelous thing, but you'll find that the man who says in verse 9, "Cast me not off in the time of old age, forsake me not when my strength faileth. For mine enemies speak against me, and they that lay wait for my soul take counsel together," is the same man that will say this in verse 14, "But I will hope continually, and will yet praise thee more and more. My mouth shall show forth thy righteousness and thy salvation all the day, for I know not the numbers." And as the same man that says, verse 20, "Thou which hast showed me great and sore trouble shall quicken me again." And the man who says in verse 22, "I will also praise thee with the psaltery, even thy truth, O my God," and says in verse 23, "My lips shall greatly..." It's the same man who comes alive in the first of Kings, chapter 1. And as this man encourages himself in the promise of God, you'll see the Spirit of the King come alive in Psalm 71. Well, let's hold Psalm 71 and come back to the first of Kings, and let me show you the psalm in the story, just that we might synchronize the two together. So just briefly, one or 2 points of contact. It says this, first of Kings chapter 1. So remember when it says in verse 1, "Now King David was old," that's Psalm 71 verse 9 and verse 18. And when it says in the first of Kings chapter 1 and verse 5, "Then Adonijah the son of Haggith exalted himself," that's really Psalm 70 verse 3, when it says, "Let them be turned back for a reward of their shame that say, Aha, aha," because that was the spirit of Adonijah on this occasion. "Aha, my opportunity has come to be king." And when it says in the first of Kings chapter 1 and verse 15 that the king was very old in the bedchamber, that's really Psalm 71 verse 7, where David laments, "I am as a wonder to many, and they took his illness as a token and a portent from God that he was suffering because of sin." When the first of Kings chapter 1 verse 19 says that Adonijah and Abiathar and Joab had collaborated together in the matter of the rebellion, that's Psalm 71 verse 4. "Deliver me, O my God, out of the hand of the wicked, out of the hand of the unrighteous, out of the hand of the cruel man." And they were all there together, you see. Adonijah the wicked man, Abiathar the unrighteous man, Joab the cruel man, all there in this plot to overthrow the king. When the first of Kings chapter 1 verse 29 says, "And the king sware and said, As Yahweh liveth that hath redeemed my soul out of all distress," that's Psalm 71. And verse 23, when it says, "My lips shall greatly rejoice when I sing unto thee, and my soul which thou hast redeemed." Oh yes, I think this psalm is locked into the story of the first of Kings, chapter 1. And here, by way of exhortation, brothers and sisters, is the power of God's promise to enthuse and invigorate the mind even when the physical powers are exhausted. You know, brothers and sisters, our minds are forever young, are they not? There are occasions as life progresses that our body lets us down, but our mind soars free, and David's mind was still alive and passionate for spiritual things. Now let me show you one last connection that pulls all this together, I think, wonderfully well. If you come back to the first of Kings, chapter 1, and verse 48, you notice what David said on the occasion of this coronation of his son. So let's pull together the threads of what we've discovered in our study this morning, and the power of the mind over the body, the triumph of the mind over the body. In the first of Kings 1, verse 48, it says this, the time of the coronation of Solomon. "And also thus saith the king, Blessed be Yahweh Elohim of Israel, which hath given me one to sit on my throne this day, mine eyes even seeing it, mine eyes even seeing it. Now, you'd never know where that comes from, would you? I think that comes from the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7 and the promise made to David. I think that's where David's mind was. Bathsheba has taken him there. Now come and have a look, you see. In the 2nd of Samuel chapter 7, the record says this. David says, "All that God might be blessed, which has given me one to sit on my throne, mine eyes even seeing it." And this is what the promise to David says, 2nd of Samuel 7, verse 16. "Thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever." Oh, but did you see what the promise was? Thy house and thy kingdom, thy throne shall be established forever before thee. In the presence of David. His own eyes would see it, was the promise of the great covenant of 2nd of Samuel 7. "Your eyes shall see the king that sits upon the throne. Blessed be God," says David in the 1st of Kings 1 verse 48. "And he saw in the crowning of Solomon an earnest of the day when he would see the man ascend the throne in his presence who would fulfill the promise." But of course David knew that the real king and the real throne was yet to come when Messiah should ascend. That's the real fulfillment, isn't it, of the 2nd of Samuel 7, when Messiah comes. And there's only one way, brothers and sisters, when Messiah comes to sit upon David's throne, there's only one way that David can see it with his eyes. And that's if he's raised from the dead, which, by the way, is the promise of the covenant. That in order for it to be done before him, he will have to be raised. Now come to Psalm 71. Psalm 71? Yes, Psalm 71 says that's exactly how David understood this matter. And it's this that must have stirred his mind with the hope of wondrous things yet to come. So in Psalm 71, he will say this in understanding and appreciation of the promise. Verse 20. "Thou, which hast showed me great and sore troubles, shall quicken me again, and shall bring me up again from the depths of the earth. And thou shalt increase my greatness and comfort me on every side." You see, this was David's hope, the hope of the resurrection. The hope of the resurrection, that one day he might be there to see with his own eyes the real king enthroned upon the throne. And I can just see, as David's mind reflected on these things, how he was stirred from his bed again by the power of the truth. What a wonderful exhortation to us, brothers and sisters, whenever we're afflicted with physical infirmity, to know that the truth can lift us, transport us out of our despair, to think on wondrous things again, and to bestir ourselves to the service of God. So this is what he prayed for in Psalm 71. Verse 18. "Now also when I am old and grey-headed, O God, forsake me not until I have showed thy strength unto this generation and thy power to every one that is to come." David just didn't pray for his own recovery, brothers and sisters. He prayed as a God-centered man prays, for his recovery, that the truth might be shown, that he might pass the passionate flame of the truth on to the next generation before he died. "Oh, that thou wouldst preserve my life until I have showed thy truth to the generation to come," he says. "Let it be so," cries David from his bedchamber. Now, do you know, God remarkably answered that prayer. And he didn't just get up off his bed, brothers and sisters, but he was blessed with such tremendous recovery of power that he went out and accomplished an enormous number of things in the spirit of how God answered him. So how did that happen? Well, that is, God willing, our study tomorrow.